I was standing outside the boardroom when she said it. 38th floor. Atlanta skyline behind her, like a backdrop she'd paid for. Sienna Carter, cream blazer, bone-straight hair, the kind of voice that fills rooms it hasn't earned, stood at the head of a mahogany table my father's hands had touched 1,000 times before hers ever did. "I intend to lead Hargrove Capital," she said, "as its next chief executive officer." 2 seconds of silence. Then the laughter came. She thought they were laughing at her nerves, at her ambition, at something she'd mispronounced. She didn't know they'd just seen me step into the doorway. She didn't know my name. She didn't know whose table that was. She didn't know anything that mattered. Before we go any further, what time is it where you are right now? Drop your time and your country in the comments. The first thing you need to understand about me is that I was never supposed to be invisible. That was a choice I made. Deliberately, carefully, the way you choose which cards to show at a table where everyone else thinks they're holding the best hand. My name is Amelia Hargrove. Not Amelia Wells, the name I used for the first 30 years of my life, before Derek slid a ring onto my finger at a restaurant in Buckhead and told me quietly that hyphenating would confuse his investors. I remember nodding. I remember thinking it was a small thing. You give up small things in the beginning because you believe the person asking understands the weight of what you're handing them. Derek did not understand that weight. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I grew up in a house on Cascade Road in southwest Atlanta, the kind of neighborhood that doesn't make it into travel guides, but raises people who run things. My father, Elias Hargrove, built Hargrove Capital Group from a single office on Auburn Avenue with 2 employees, a fax machine, and a reputation for being the kind of man who never raised his voice because he never needed to. By the time I was 12, his firm managed private equity portfolios for 37 clients. By the time I was 22, that number was over 200. By the time he died a Tuesday in November 7 years ago, a cardiac event so sudden that his coffee was still warm when they found him, Hargrove Capital was worth $340 million. I was the only child. I say that not for sympathy. I say it because it matters to what comes next. My father never talked about succession planning the way other men in his position did. He didn't call lawyers into rooms and draw org charts on whiteboards. He talked to me instead. On Sunday mornings over eggs and the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. On drives to Piedmont Park when I was in high school. In the last 3 years of his life, when he knew something was wrong with his heart, long before the doctors gave it a name, he talked to me the way a man talks when he's trying to make sure a building stays standing after he's gone. The loudest person in the room, he told me once sitting at the same mahogany table Sienna Carter would one day stand at, is almost never the most powerful one. I was 35 when he died. Already married to Derek for 4 years. Already building a life that looked from the outside like the life of a man's wife rather than a man's heir. That was by design. Mine, not his. Derek Wells came into my life at a charity gala for the UNCF, well-dressed, well-spoken, with an easy confidence that I mistook for a long time for substance. He was a mid-level portfolio manager at a firm across town. Smart enough, ambitious enough. The kind of man who studies rooms when he enters them and calculates quickly who is worth knowing. He calculated correctly when he found me. I just didn't realize until much later exactly what his calculation had been. We married 11 months after we met. My father walked me down the aisle at Cascade United Methodist Church on a Saturday in April. He shook Derek's hand at the reception and said something to him I never heard. Derek laughed. My father did not. I should have asked what was said. After my father died, the estate moved through probate quietly. I had a lawyer, Nathaniel Cross, old family friend, the kind of attorney who keeps files in actual physical folders, in actual physical cabinets. And he handled everything the way my father had instructed. The house went to a preservation trust. The Auburn Avenue office building went to a community foundation. And the controlling interest in Hargrove Capital Group, 51% of outstanding shares, was transferred per the terms of a document signed 6 months before my father's death, into my name, not Derek's. Mine. There was also an envelope. Cream-colored letter-sized my name written on the front in my father's handwriting, the same handwriting that used to sign my report cards. My permission slips my birthday cards every year without fail. Nathaniel handed it to me at the end of our first meeting after the funeral. He told me my father had asked him to wait until probate was complete before giving it to me. I took it home. I put it in the drawer of my nightstand. I did not open it. I don't know exactly why. Grief does strange things to logic. Part of me believed that as long as the envelope stayed sealed, there was still something left of him I hadn't finished receiving. Part of me wasn't ready for instructions I'd have to follow alone. Derek never knew the envelope existed. He never knew the full terms of the estate. He knew I had inherited shares, I told him that much, but I let him assume they were a minority stake. A sentimental inheritance. Something symbolic that didn't move the needle. He assumed that for 7 years. He built an entire plan around that assumption, and I let him, because I was watching. Because I had learned from the man whose initials were carved into the underside of that boardroom table, that the most dangerous thing you can do to someone who underestimates you is let them keep doing it right up until the moment it costs them everything. The first sign that something was wrong didn't come from Derek's phone. It didn't come from a receipt or a perfume I didn't recognize, or any of the things women in my position are told to look for. It came from a calendar notification. A small gray rectangle on the screen of my laptop, a laptop Derek had borrowed the week before to print something, and apparently synced his work calendar to without realizing. Board strategy session, Hargrove Capital Thursday, 7 p.m. Attendees, D. Wells S. Carter R. Okafor. I was the one who approved board meeting agendas. I was the one Nathaniel CC'd on every governance communication. I had not been informed of any Thursday meeting. I closed the laptop. I finished my coffee. I sat at the kitchen table on Habersham Road for a long time, looking at the last of the morning light coming through the window over the sink. Then I picked up my phone and called Nathaniel Cross. Nathaniel Cross picked up on the second ring. He always did. That was one of the things my father had loved about him. The man treated phone calls the way surgeons treat incisions, immediate, precise, no wasted motion. He'd been practicing law in Atlanta for 38 years. He had a voice like gravel and cedar, and he never said anything he didn't mean. Amelia. Not a question. Just my name the way people say it when they've been half expecting your call. Nathaniel. I need to ask you something about the governance structure at Hargrove. A pause. Not long. Maybe 3 seconds. But Nathaniel Cross did not pause unless something required it. Come to the office, he said. Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. Bring nothing. I'll have everything you need already pulled. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was panicking. I want to be clear about that. What kept me awake wasn't fear. It was the specific, uncomfortable sensation of a picture coming into focus that you'd been deliberately not looking at for longer than you should have. The shapes had always been there. I had simply chosen in the way you choose not to press on a bruise, not to look directly at them. The Thursday meeting was one shape, but there were others. 3 months earlier, Derek had asked me casually over dinner the way he asked things he'd rehearsed, whether I'd ever considered formalizing my role at Hargrove. You've always been involved behind the scenes, he said, refilling my glass without being asked. But there might be value in making that official, giving you a title, something appropriate. He said the word appropriate with a particular gentleness that I had at the time taken for consideration. I understood now what kind of title he'd had in mind. something visible enough to seem inclusive, something with no operational authority. 2 months earlier, a man named Roland Okafor, a board member my father had appointed 12 years ago, someone I'd known since I was in my 20s, had called me on a Sunday afternoon. He asked how I was doing. We talked for 20 minutes about nothing urgent. Before he hung up, he said, "Your father was a careful man, Amelia. He didn't do anything without a reason. I always respected that about him." Then he said goodbye. I had filed the call away as sentiment. I retrieved it from that file now and looked at it differently. Roland had been on that Thursday meeting invitation. I arrived at Nathaniel's office at 8:47 a.m. The building was a converted Victorian on Peachtree Street, narrow and unhurried looking, the kind of place that didn't need to announce itself. The receptionist, a woman named Gloria, who had been there since before I was born, handed me a cup of coffee without asking how I took it. She already knew. Nathaniel was at his desk when I walked in. On the table beside him, 2 manila folders, a yellow legal pad with handwriting I couldn't read from the doorway, and a document in a clear plastic sleeve that I recognized before I got close enough to confirm it. My father's shareholder agreement. "Sit down," Nathaniel said. I sat. "Your husband has been meeting privately with 3 board members for approximately 4 months. He said it the way you read a weather report, not unkindly but without insulation. The meetings have been informal, off-calendar. Roland Okafor brought it to my attention 6 weeks ago. He was invited to the first 2 and declined further involvement. That was why Roland had called." "What's the objective?" I asked. Nathaniel opened the first folder. Inside a single sheet of paper, a draft organizational chart for Hargrove Capital Group dated 8 weeks prior. I scanned it in less than 10 seconds because I only needed to find 2 things. My name appeared once, in a box labeled Advisory Council Non-Voting. Sienna Carter's name appeared at the top, in a box labeled Chief Executive Officer Designate. I looked at the chart for a moment. Then I set it down on the desk with the same care I would use setting down something fragile, though my hands were not shaking. They were very still. Sometimes stillness is the only honest response to something that both surprises you and doesn't surprise you at all. "He doesn't know," I said. Not a question. "He doesn't know," Nathaniel confirmed. "He has never reviewed the full estate documentation. He has seen the summary. The summary was accurate, but incomplete. He believes you hold a passive minority interest somewhere in the range of 18 to 22% based on conversations my paralegal overheard at a function last spring. 18 to 22%. Derek had been building a palace on land he didn't own." "The second folder," Nathaniel said. I opened it. Inside was a 2-page document, a proposed amendment to Hargrove Capital's shareholder agreement. It would create a new class of non-voting preferred shares, retroactively reclassifying the block my father had left me. It required signatures from the majority shareholder and 2 board members to pass. My signature was already on it. I looked at the signature for a long time. Then I looked at Nathaniel. "That's not my signature," I said. "No," he said. "It is not." The coffee cup in my hand was warm. Outside Peachtree Street was doing what it always did, moving indifferent, full of people with their own quiet urgencies. I thought about my father at the head of that mahogany table. I thought about the envelope in my nightstand drawer that I still hadn't opened. I thought about Derek at the kitchen counter that morning, straightening his tie in the reflection of the microwave door, asking me if I'd seen his Mont Blanc pen. I had seen it. It was in the pocket of a jacket he'd left on the chair in the bedroom. The same jacket he'd been wearing according to the dry cleaning receipt I'd found in it 3 weeks earlier on a Thursday evening in January. "Nathaniel," I said, "I need you to tell me exactly what I'm allowed to do." He leaned back in his chair. For the first time that morning, something that wasn't quite a smile moved across his face. "Amelia," he said, "you can do almost anything you want." That's the part he never figured out. I drove back to Habersham Road at 11:15 a.m. with both folders on the passenger seat and a clarity in my chest that I hadn't felt in months. Not anger, something colder and more useful than anger. Derek's car was in the driveway. He wasn't supposed to be home until 6. I sat in my car for 30 seconds, engine off, looking at the back of his Audi, that particular shade of dark gray he'd chosen because someone had told him it read as serious. And I made a decision about how I was going to walk through my own front door. Calmly, without acceleration, the way my father walked into rooms. Derek was in the study when I came in. He was on the phone, leaning back in the leather chair he'd had shipped from a store in New York 2 years ago, the one he always positioned so that anyone entering the room would see him from his best angle. He held up one finger when he saw me. 1 minute. I nodded and went to the kitchen and put my bag down, and stood at the counter and looked out the window over the sink and listened. His voice carried. "Not going to be an issue. She's not operationally involved. Never has been." A pause. "The meeting's set for the 14th. Sienna will present the restructuring proposal. By the time anyone thinks to ask questions, the amendment will already be..." Another pause longer. "Roland is not going to be a problem. He had his chance to be part of this." I turned on the faucet. Not to drown him out, to give him the sound of domesticity. The sound of a wife in a kitchen not listening. He came in 4 minutes later, phone in his pocket. Mont Blanc pen clicking open and closed in his right hand the way it did when he was working something out internally. "Didn't know you were going out this morning," he said. "Errands," I said. Nathaniel needed a signature on something for the estate. The pen stopped clicking for exactly 1 beat. Then started again. "Anything I should know about..." "Routine," I said. "Annual compliance filing. Nothing interesting." He opened the refrigerator and stood in front of it the way men do when they're not actually looking for food. "I've been thinking about the Hargrove board calendar," he said to the refrigerator. "There's a session coming up I'd like you to be part of. Showface. Remind people you're connected to the legacy." He paused. "It might be good for you." I turned off the faucet, dried my hands on the dish towel hanging from the oven handle. Looked at him. "Which session?" I asked. "Preliminary strategy. The 14th. He turned from the refrigerator with a bottle of sparkling water he hadn't wanted. "Dress formally. These are people who respond to presentation." He said it with such complete, unguarded confidence that for a moment I almost felt something adjacent to pity. Almost. "I'll keep that in mind," I said. He went back to the study. I stood at the counter for another minute. Then I went upstairs to the bedroom, closed the door, sat on the edge of the bed, and opened the nightstand drawer. The envelope was where it had always been. Cream-colored. My name in my father's hand. Slightly worn at the corner where I'd picked it up and set it back down a dozen times without opening it. I opened it. Inside 2 pages handwritten, dated 4 months before my father died. Not a legal document. Not instructions for Nathaniel, just a letter. His handwriting, which I had known my entire life, slightly right-leaning, unhurried, every capital letter given its full height. "Amelia. If Nathaniel has given you this, then I'm gone, and you're sitting somewhere trying to figure out what comes next. I know you. You've probably already figured out most of it. The shares are yours. All of it, the building on Auburn, the seat at the table, the name on the door. I didn't give it to you because you're my daughter. I gave it to you because you're the only person I've ever met who understands that power isn't something you display. It's something you hold. There's a man sitting somewhere in your life right now who thinks he's building something. Let him build. Let him get comfortable. Let him make his plans and sign his documents and schedule his meetings. And then when the time comes, walk into the room. Just walk in, baby. That's all you have to do. The room will do the rest. Dad, I read it twice. Then I folded it back along its original creases and put it in the inside pocket of my blazer against my chest. Then I picked up my phone and called Nathaniel. I want to call an emergency board meeting, I said. Majority shareholder privilege, full governance protocol. I want it scheduled for the 14th, same day as Derek's session. Same time, same room. A pause. That will supersede his meeting entirely, Nathaniel said. I know. He won't know you called it until the notice goes out. I know that too. Amelia. His voice was careful. Once you send that notice, there's no version of this that stays quiet. I looked at my reflection in the mirror, out above the dresser. The antique gold signet ring on my right hand. The blazer my father had told me the last Christmas he was alive made me look like someone who owned things. Nathaniel, I said, send the notice. The email went out at 4:47 p.m. that afternoon. 7 board members. Nathaniel's office as registered agent. Subject line, emergency board session. Hargrove Capital Group, called by majority shareholder. Date the 14th, attendance mandatory. Sender name Amelia Hargrove. Majority shareholder Hargrove Capital Group. I was downstairs making dinner when Derek's phone lit up on the kitchen counter. He'd left it charging while he showered. I wasn't trying to see it. I was reaching past it for the olive oil. The notification preview was enough. His screen showed the subject line. Then below it, the sender name. I picked up the olive oil. I turned on the burner. I listened to the shower running upstairs and the city moving outside and the small, ordinary sounds of a house that was after 11 years finally about to become just mine. He came downstairs 22 minutes later. Hair still damp, phone in his hand. Face arranged into something I'd never quite seen on him before. Not anger, not confusion, but the particular expression of a man who has just discovered that the floor he was standing on was never as solid as he'd believed. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at me. I put a plate on the table. Dinner's ready, I said. Derek didn't eat dinner that night. He sat at the table for 11 minutes, I know, because the timer on the oven was still counting down. And I watched it without appearing to. And he moved food around his plate with the focused non-attention of a man running calculations behind his eyes. I ate. I asked him about a contractor we'd been trying to schedule for the back porch. He answered in fragments. I poured water. The city outside the kitchen window did what it always did at that hour, settled into its evening register the particular low frequency of Atlanta after dark. He left the table without clearing his plate. That told me everything about his internal state. Derek Wells had impeccable surface manners. He cleared plates. He held doors. He refilled glasses before they were empty. Manners were armor for him, the thing he wore so consistently that their absence was louder than any words. He went to the study. The door didn't close all the way. I washed the dishes, dried them, put them away in the correct cabinets. Then I went upstairs, changed into clothes I could think clearly in a worn Howard University sweatshirt, dark slack socks, and sat at the small desk in the room I used as an office, the one Derek had twice suggested converting into a guest room, and I opened my laptop. I had work to do. The first thing I did was call Roland Okafor. It was 8:20 p.m. He picked up on the first ring. I got the notice, he said before I could speak. I know. Amelia. His voice had the texture of someone who had been waiting for a particular conversation and was relieved it had finally arrived. I should have called you sooner. I want you to know that. You called when you could, I said. I understand the position you were in. A pause. Then, "Your father would have done exactly what you're doing, the exact same way." He said it quietly, like a thing being handed over carefully. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to be in that room on the 14th. In your seat. On time. I'll be there. And Roland, don't tell Derek we spoke." "Derek and I haven't spoken in 3 weeks," he said. "He stopped returning my calls after I declined the second meeting." I thanked him and hung up. The second thing I did was read every governance document in the Hargrove Capital Digital Archive that I had access to as majority shareholder, which was, as Nathaniel had reminded me that morning, with a precision I was still absorbing all of them. I read the original shareholder agreement my father had drafted in 1987. I read the 2 amendments passed in 2003 and 2011. I read the board charter. I read the bylaws. I read the conflict of interest policy and the related party transaction disclosure requirements, and the succession protocol my father had written himself in plain language on 4 pages that were clearer and more airtight than anything a committee would have produced. I read the document with my forged signature. I read it slowly, the way you read something you're going to need to be able to discuss without notes, and I made a list in the margins of my legal pad, not of problems, but of facts. The date it was drafted. The notarization number, which Nathaniel had already flagged as irregular. The specific language used to reclassify the shares, which borrowed phrasing from a 2019 amendment proposal that had been rejected by the board and never formally filed. Someone had done research. Not enough, but some. That told me Derek hadn't written it alone. The third thing I did, the thing that took the longest, the thing I'd been putting off without fully acknowledging I was putting it off, was sit with what I was about to do to my marriage. Not to Derek, to the marriage. Those are different things. 11 years is not nothing. Even when it becomes something you can't save. 11 years of shared mornings and accumulated shorthand, and the specific muscle memory of living alongside another person that doesn't disappear cleanly. I wasn't grieving Derek exactly. I wasn't sure I'd been in love with him for some time. But I was grieving the version of the story I had told myself for 11 years, that the smallness I sometimes felt in our life together was something I had chosen and could unchoose when I was ready. I understood now that Derek had been counting on that smallness, had been in his careful and deliberate way tending it. That was the thing that moved through me slowly, sitting at my desk at 10 p.m. with Atlanta quiet outside the window, not rage. I want to be precise about this, but a clean structural anger. The kind that doesn't burn, the kind that builds. I closed my laptop at 11:30. I went to the bathroom, washed my face, looked at myself in the mirror for a moment, not for reassurance, just to check that I was still the same person I'd been that morning, which I was, plus the contents of 1 letter. When I came to bed, Derek was already there, lying on his side, facing away. His breathing had the specific evenness of a person pretending to sleep. I knew that rhythm. I had heard it before on nights when he'd come home late and didn't want to answer questions. I lay down. I looked at the ceiling. "The meeting on the 14th, he said. To the wall, not to me. His voice was controlled in the way that costs something. "We should talk about it." "We will," I said, "when there's something to talk about." He was quiet for a long time. "Amelia." My name in his mouth at that hour, in that room, careful and newly respectful, and approximately 4 years too late. "How long have you known?" I turned off my bedside lamp. "Long enough," I said. I was asleep before he found an answer. The days between that night and the 14th were the quietest of my life. Not peaceful quiet, the way a room is quiet when everyone in it is waiting. Derek moved through the house with the careful deliberateness of a man renegotiating his understanding of his own situation. He was not cruel. He was not explosive. He was, if anything, more attentive than he'd been in years, offering coffee in the mornings, asking about my day with something that resembled genuine interest. Whether that was remorse or strategy, I couldn't entirely determine. Possibly both. I let him be attentive. I answered his questions. I slept on my side of the bed and wore my father's ring, and checked my email twice a day for board confirmations. All 7 members confirmed attendance. Nathaniel called on the 12th to tell me that the forged document had been formally flagged by the firm's outside counsel, who had been quietly retained without Derek's knowledge on the basis that an unsigned opinion from a handwriting specialist showed a 94% probability of forgery. On the morning of the 13th, I went to my closet and stood in front of it for a long time. My father had a theory about clothes in professional settings, not about fashion, about message. "What you wear," he told me once when I was 26 and anxious about a presentation, "should answer the question before anyone has the chance to ask it." He'd bought me a blazer that day, dark charcoal, structured, the kind of garment that didn't ask permission from the room it entered. I still had it. I took it off the hanger, pressed it, hung it on the back of the door. Then I went downstairs and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the morning light coming through the window and thought about my father walking into rooms. The particular way he moved, not fast, not slow, just fully present in each step, as if arriving somewhere, was a thing worth doing completely. I thought about a table with his initials carved into the underside of the left corner. I thought about a room full of people who were about to remember whose name was on the door. Tomorrow, I would walk in. That was all I had to do. The morning of the 14th arrived, the way significant days sometimes do, ordinary on the surface, with no atmospheric indication that anything was different from any other Tuesday in November. I was up at 5:47 a.m., not because I'd set an alarm, because my body understood what the day required and decided on its own that sleep had finished its job. I lay still for a few minutes in the gray early light, listening to Derek's breathing beside me. Still that same performed evenness, though by now I suspected he was no longer performing it for my benefit, but for his own. And then I got up quietly and went downstairs and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window and watched the sky over Atlanta do what Atlanta skies do in November. Lighten slowly, reluctantly, in shades of pewter and pale gold. Derek came down at 7:15. Dressed already, the charcoal suit he reserved for high-stakes presentations, his Mont Blanc pen in his breast pocket. He looked at me across the kitchen, and I could see him doing the same calculation he'd been running for days, how much I knew, how much I'd act on, whether there was still some version of this morning that ended differently than he now feared. He poured coffee. He stood at the counter. "Amelia," he said, "before we go in today, I want to talk." I looked at him. "We'll talk after," I said. "After might be..." He stopped, started again. "I want you to understand that whatever you think you know about Sienna..." "Derek." I said his name the way my father used to say things that weren't questions, flat and final and taking up exactly the space they needed. "We'll talk after." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he put down his coffee cup and picked up his keys and walked out the front door without finishing his sentence. I stood in the kitchen alone. The house was very quiet. I got dressed. The charcoal blazer, a silk blouse the color of deep water, dark slacks pressed, my father's ring on my right hand, a single document in a slim leather portfolio, not the forged amendment, not the shareholder agreement, not any of Nathaniel's folders. Just one page. The original share transfer document my father had signed 14 months before he died, with my name on it, in his handwriting, notarized and filed with the state of Georgia in a registration that had never been contested because no one had ever thought to look. I drove to the Hargrove Capitol building on Peachtree Center Avenue alone, parked in the structure across the street. rode the elevator to the lobby, nodded to the security desk attendant, a man named Curtis, who had worked the building for 9 years and had known my father well enough to keep a photograph of him in the break room. "Morning, Miss Hargrove," Curtis said. "Morning, Curtis." I did not go up to the 38th floor immediately. I went first to the 37th, a conference level that had a small lounge at the end of the corridor with a window that looked out over the same skyline as the boardroom above. I stood there for 10 minutes, drank a cup of water, read my father's letter one more time, though by now I had it memorized. Just walk in, baby. That's all you have to do. At 9:48 a.m., I took the stairs one floor up. The boardroom door was slightly open. That was when I heard her. Sienna Carter's voice carried the way voices do when they're accustomed to being the most important sound in whatever space they occupy. She was already at the head of the table. I could see her through the gap, the cream blazer I would later learn she'd had dry cleaned twice in the preceding week, the bone-straight hair, the posture of someone who had rehearsed this moment enough times that it had started to feel like memory rather than anticipation. Derek was seated to her left. 3 board members I recognized were in their chairs. 2 more were still settling in. Roland Okafor sat at the far end of the table, hands folded, expression neutral in the way of a man who knows how something ends and is simply waiting for it to arrive. I stood outside the door and listened. "The future of Hargrove Capital," Sienna said. And her voice had that particular lift of someone arriving at a line they've been building toward, needs fresh vision, new energy. And I intend to bring both as its next chief executive officer. 2 seconds of silence. Then someone laughed. A short, involuntary sound, the kind that escapes before the professional filter catches it. Then another. Then the soft, unmistakable exhale of Roland Okafor, who was not laughing exactly, but whose shoulders had dropped 2 inches in what I recognized as relief. Sienna's face changed. She looked around the table at the laughter, at the faces that were not laughing, but were doing something equally damaging, which was looking past her. And she did not yet understand what any of it meant. Derek understood. I could see it in the set of his jaw, the slight forward tilt of his body, the way his hand moved toward the Mont Blanc pen in his pocket, and then stopped. He'd seen me before I'd fully stepped into the doorway. His eyes found me the way eyes find the thing they've been dreading, in the peripheral vision, sudden and complete. I stepped into the room. I did not rush. I did not announce myself. I walked to the empty chair at the opposite end of the table from Sienna, the chair my father had always occupied, the one no one had sat in since he died, because there existed in that room an unspoken agreement that it was not available. And I set my leather portfolio on the table in front of it, and I sat down. The room completed its settling. Margaret Osei, the board's senior independent member, 71 years old, who had been appointed by my father in 2009, and who wore the same style of pearl earrings every meeting without variation, rose from her chair. "Miss Carter," she said in the tone of a woman who had been in enough boardrooms to have no patience for the alternative. "I think there may have been some confusion about who called this meeting." Sienna looked at Margaret, then at Derek, then at me. I watched her process it. The way understanding moves across a person's face when it arrives in a form they weren't prepared for, not a wave, but a series of small sequential adjustments. Eyes, jaw, the almost imperceptible shift in the set of her shoulders. She looked at me the way people look at someone they've never considered as a variable. "I'm sorry," she said. "And you are?" "Amelia Hargrove," I said. I said it the way my father said his own name in rooms where it needed to land, without decoration, without volume, without anything extra. Just the name itself, taking up its full amount of space. Elias Hargrove was my father. This is his table. I put my hand flat on the mahogany surface. My right hand. The gold ring catching the light. The room was very quiet. Derek's pen had stopped moving entirely. Sienna opened her mouth, then closed it, then opened it again, with the specific desperation of someone searching for a register they no longer had access to. "Derek told me," she started. "Miss Carter." Margaret O'Sea's voice was not unkind, but it was absolute. "Perhaps you'd like to take a seat while we proceed." Sienna looked at the seat Margaret indicated, not the head of the table. A middle chair, a guest chair. The kind of chair that communicates exactly what you are in a room and what you are not. She sat. Derek had not moved. He was looking at the table in front of him with the expression of a man watching an infrastructure he'd spent years constructing, being weight-tested for the first time. I opened my leather portfolio. I removed the single page inside. I placed it in the center of the table where everyone could see my father's handwriting, my name and the notarization stamp from 14 months before his death. Then I looked up. "I'd like to call this meeting to order," I said. The document sat in the center of the table like a stone dropped into still water. No one touched it immediately. That was the thing about rooms full of people who understood what documents meant. They read them from a distance first, the way you assess weight before you lift something. Margaret O'Sea leaned forward slightly, reading without reaching. The two board members to her right exchanged a glance that communicated something I didn't need to hear to understand. Roland Okafor at the far end of the table did not lean forward at all. He had already seen it. Nathaniel had sent him a copy 3 days ago. Sienna was looking at it the way someone looks at something written in a language they almost recognize. Derek was not looking at it. Derek was looking at me. I let the silence run its natural length. My father had taught me that too, that silence in a room full of professionals is not empty, it's working. Let it work. Don't fill it with your own anxiety. The silence is yours if you're the one who isn't afraid of it. After approximately 40 seconds, Margaret picked up the document. She read it in full, turned to the second page, read that, set it down. "This is the original share transfer instrument," she said. It was not a question. "Filed with the Georgia Secretary of State's office on March 3, 2018 inches," I said. 14 months before my father's death. The filing number is in the footer. Nathaniel Cross's office has the certified copy, if anyone would like to verify. Margaret nodded once. She passed the document to her left. It moved around the table the way important things move. In rooms where people know what they're handling carefully with both hands, each person taking the time they needed before passing it on. When it reached the board member directly to Derek's right, a man named Philip Reese, corporate attorney who had joined the board 4 years ago on Derek's recommendation. Philip held it for a long time without passing it further. 51%, Philip said, to no one specifically. The number of a man recalculating. 51%, I confirmed. Sienna made a sound. Not a word, a sound the kind that precedes words when the words haven't organized themselves yet. She turned to Derek with the expression of a woman who had just discovered that the map she'd been handed described a different territory entirely. "You told me she had a minority stake," she said. Her voice had changed a register. The performance had gone out of it, leaving something rawer underneath. "You said 18%. You said it was symbolic. You said, Sienna." Derek's voice was low and controlled in the way of a man who understood that the next several minutes would determine the rest of his professional life, and was attempting to manage them with whatever tools he had left. "Don't." She said it quietly. One word, the kind that ends something. She turned back to the table, to the document that had now completed its circuit and returned to the center, to the 7 faces of people who were watching her with varying degrees of sympathy and professional detachment. I watched her absorb it, The full geometry of what she'd walked into this morning, the cream blazer, the rehearsed lines, the title she'd been promised by a man who did not have the authority to promise it. I felt something I hadn't expected to feel in that room, not satisfaction exactly, but a kind of sorrow for the particular way women get used in other people's ambitions and told they're being elevated. That feeling lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then Philip Reese cleared his throat and slid a second document onto the table. Face up, toward the center. The forged amendment. "Miss Hargrove," he said, and his voice had the careful flatness of a man in the early stages of legal self-preservation. "I want the board to know that I was presented with this document 3 weeks ago and asked to review it as part of a proposed governance restructuring. I was not informed of its full provenance. I did not advise its use. I want that stated clearly for the record." The room absorbed that. Derek's jaw moved once. He said nothing. I looked at the forged amendment on the table. My name on the signature line in handwriting that was close, genuinely close, which told me someone had studied my signature for some time, but not mine. The loops slightly too uniform. The pressure slightly too consistent. Handwriting, when it's real, has irregularities that come from breathing, from thinking, from the small physical interruptions of being a person in a moment. Forgeries are too controlled. They look like handwriting more than handwriting does. "I'd like to note for the record," I said, "that I did not sign that document. The firm's outside counsel retained a handwriting specialist whose preliminary assessment indicates a 94% probability that the signature is not authentic. A formal report is being prepared and will be filed with this board within 10 business days." Margaret wrote something on her legal pad. The sound of her pen was the loudest thing in the room. "Who prepared this document?" she asked, addressing the table, not anyone specifically. The kind of question that creates its own pressure by being left open. Silence. Philip Reese looked at his hands. Derek looked at the window. "It was prepared," I said, "on the letterhead of this firm, using a template drawn from the 2019 amendment proposal that was rejected by this board and never filed. The metadata on the digital version, which Nathaniel Cross's office has already retrieved from the firm's document management system, shows it was created on a Tuesday evening, approximately 8 weeks ago at 9:23 p.m., from a workstation registered to a user account with administrative access." I paused. "The account is registered to my husband." The room did not erupt. These were not people who erupted. What happened instead was a particular quality of stillness, the stillness of 7 professionals, simultaneously updating their understanding of what the next several months of their professional obligations were going to require. Sienna was very still. She was looking at a fixed point on the mahogany table, and I could see in the set of her mouth and the angle of her chin the specific expression of a woman doing the rapid, painful arithmetic of how much she had not known and how much that not knowing had cost her. Roland Okafor spoke for the first time since the meeting began. "Elias Hargrove," he said to no one in particular in the tone of a man paying a debt of respect, "built something that lasted." He looked at me. He knew it would. I looked back at him, the ring on my right hand, the table under my palms. "There's one more thing," I said. I reached into my leather portfolio and removed a second page, one I hadn't shown Nathaniel, hadn't mentioned to Roland, hadn't discussed with anyone. A document I had prepared myself at my desk on the night of the 12th at 11:14 p.m., with a cup of cold tea and the quiet of a house in which all the relevant decisions had already been made. I placed it on the table. It was a formal notice of intent. Majority shareholder privilege. 3 items. The first, an immediate freeze on all pending governance amendments until a full independent audit of the firm's document management system was complete. The second, the appointment of an interim oversight committee. Roland Okafor, Margaret Osei, and 1 external independent director, to be named within 14 days, to manage day-to-day operations during the transition period. The third was the one that made Philip Reese stop breathing for a moment. The third was a formal request for the voluntary resignation of any board member or officer who had been present at any undisclosed off-calendar meeting related to the proposed restructuring, effective immediately, with full documentation of their participation to be submitted to the board's legal counsel within 48 hours. Voluntary, with documentation submitted cooperatively. The alternative, which I did not need to state because everyone in the room had enough professional experience to complete the sentence themselves, was considerably less voluntary and considerably more public. Derek picked up his Mont Blanc pen. He held it in his hand. He looked at it for a moment with the expression of a man who understood fully and finely that the thing he'd been using to signal his importance had never been the instrument of power he'd believed it was. He set it down on the table. He did not pick it up again. The 48 hours after that meeting were the quietest kind of loud. Nothing exploded. Nothing announced itself. What happened instead was the specific methodical sound of a structure coming apart at its load-bearing points, not a collapse, but a careful, unavoidable disassembly, the kind that happens when the people involved are professional enough to understand that the alternative is worse. Derek submitted his resignation letter to Nathaniel's office at 6:17 a.m. the following morning. 12 pages, which was 9 pages longer than necessary, and told me everything I needed to know about the state of his internal landscape. Nathaniel called me at 7:03 to confirm receipt. He read me the first line after careful consideration of the firm's best interests, and I told him I'd read the rest later, and he said that was probably wise. Philip Reese submitted his at noon. 2 pages, cleaner. The letter of a man who had consulted his own attorney before writing it. A third board member, someone I hadn't publicly named, but whose participation Nathaniel had documented, submitted his by end of day through his personal lawyer with a request for confidentiality that would be honored within the limits of what the law required. I was not in the office for any of this. I was at home. I want to be precise about what I mean when I say I was at home. I don't mean I was resting. I don't mean I was processing in the way that word gets used to describe a particular kind of performed emotional labor. I mean, I was at home in the oldest sense, occupying the space of my own life, with full attention doing the ordinary things that ordinary days require, and allowing the extraordinary things to complete themselves without my constant supervision. I made breakfast. I answered emails. I called my friend Diane in Washington, D.C., a woman I'd known since Howard, who had watched my marriage from a careful distance for 11 years, and said very little about what she observed, and I told her what had happened. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Your father would have liked how you did that." And I said I hoped so. And she said she was getting on a plane Friday and I should have wine. Derek came home at 4 p.m. He let himself in with his key, which I had not changed because changing it before this conversation would have been a statement I wasn't ready to make yet, and he stood in the entryway for a moment before coming further in. I was in the kitchen. He came as far as the doorway, which was as far as he'd been coming for days now, as if the kitchen were a room with a threshold he needed permission to cross. He looked older than he had 2 days ago. Not in a way visible enough to describe precisely, but in the way people age when something they've been carrying is suddenly no longer held up by the scaffolding they'd built for it. "I signed it," he said. "I know." He looked at his hands, then at me. "I need you to know that I didn't." He stopped, started differently. Sienna was another stop. I waited. "I made choices," he said finally, with the specific plainness of a man who has exhausted his more elaborate formulations and arrived at the end of them at the only sentence that was actually true. "I made choices that I can't undo. And I think we both know what that means for us." I looked at him across the kitchen. 11 years of mornings and dinners and silences and small negotiations. The weight of it was real. I didn't pretend it wasn't. But weight and correctness are different measurements, and I had known for some time longer than I'd admitted to myself which one had been running the calculation of my life. "I'll have Nathaniel reach out to your attorney," I said. "We can do this without making it harder than it needs to be." He nodded. Something in his shoulders dropped, not defeat exactly, but the release of a tension he'd been maintaining beyond its useful life. He set his key on the counter. He walked back out through the entryway. The front door closed with the sound of a well-made door in a well-built house, solid final without drama. I stood in the kitchen and listened to his car start in the driveway and pull out onto Habersham Road and move away down the street until I couldn't hear it anymore. Then I picked up his key and held it in my palm for a moment. Then I put it in the drawer next to the dish towels. Not the trash, not a box, just a drawer. Because some things deserve a few days before they become permanent. And I turned on the burner and started making dinner. I was halfway through it when my phone rang. Unknown number, Atlanta area code. I almost didn't answer. Then I did. "Miss Hargrove." A woman's voice, careful and low. "This is Sienna Carter." I turned the burner down. "Miss Carter," I said. A pause on her end that had a particular texture, not hesitation exactly, but the pause of someone who has rehearsed what they're about to say and is now deciding in real time whether the rehearsed version is the right one. "I want to say something," she said. "And I understand if you don't want to hear it. But I need to say it anyway." "Go ahead," I said. "I didn't know about your shares." She said it evenly without decoration. "I want to be clear about that. I knew about the amendment. Derek told me it was a routine restructuring that you'd agreed to a reduced role because you weren't operationally involved." I believed him. A breath. That was my mistake. I should have verified independently. I didn't. She paused again. "I was told what I wanted to hear, and I let that be enough." I stood at the stove and listened. "I'm not asking for anything," she continued. "I'm not asking you to do anything with this call. I've been sitting in my apartment since yesterday, and I keep thinking about what you must think of me. And I realized I couldn't let that stand without at least telling you that I knew less than it looked like I knew." Another pause. "That's all. I'm sorry." The line was quiet. Outside, Atlanta was doing its evening thing, the low, persistent hum of a city that doesn't fully stop. "Miss Carter," I said. "I believe you." She was quiet. "I also think," I said carefully, "that believing something because it was convenient is still believing it. And the distance between those two things is where the mistake lives." I paused. "But I don't think you're a bad person. I think you were handed a story by someone who needed you to perform a role in it. That's a different thing." She didn't say anything for a moment. "What happens now?" she asked. "For you," I said. "I don't know. That's yours to work out." I turned the burner back up. "But I'll tell you what my father told me once. He said the most expensive thing you can do in business in life is let someone else define the size of what you're allowed to want." I let that sit. "You're 31 years old. There's time to want things correctly." She was quiet again. Then, "Thank you. Take care of yourself," I said. I hung up. I stood at the stove for a long moment. The kitchen smelled like garlic and olive oil. The city murmured outside. The key was in the drawer next to the dish towels. My father's letter was in the inside pocket of a blazer hanging upstairs in my closet, where it would stay until I found a better place for it, something permanent, something worthy of the handwriting. I thought about what the next weeks would look like. The audit, the restructuring, the conversations with remaining board members, the calls from people in Atlanta's business community who would have heard what happened, and would need to recalibrate their understanding of who I was and had always been. The work of making something whole again that had been quietly undermined for years. It was a great deal of work. I found standing at that stove that I was not afraid of it. I was, in fact, and I want to be precise about this, because precision matters ready. More ready than I had been for anything in 11 years. Because for 11 years, I had been preparing for exactly this, even when I didn't know that was what I was doing. Every quiet observation, every document read, every phone call made and received. Every morning, I'd worn my father's ring without explaining it to anyone. Every time I'd held something close, because I understood in the place, where understanding lives before language reaches it, that the right moment had not yet come. The right moment had come. I plated my dinner. I sat at the kitchen table alone for the first time in 11 years, without it feeling like a lack. Outside, Atlanta moved through its evening. The skyline I'd known since childhood, the lights coming on in towers that held the offices and boardrooms and private conversations. Of a city built by people who understood that power was not given, it was constructed carefully over time. In full knowledge that the day would come when it would need to hold weight. I looked at the window, at my own reflection in it, the ring on my right hand, the table that was mine. Tomorrow I would go back in. The audit began on a Monday. Nathaniel brought in an independent forensic accounting firm from Charlotte, a team of 6, none of whom had any prior relationship with Hargrove Capital, none of whom owed anyone in the building a professional courtesy. They arrived at 8 a.m. with equipment cases and a quietness that people who do serious work in serious situations tend to carry. I met them in the lobby, introduced myself, showed them to the 36th floor, where we'd set up a dedicated workspace with full system access and a direct line to Nathaniel's office. Then I went up to the 38th floor and started my own work. The first week was administrative in the way that disasters, once they've happened, require administration. There were communications to draft careful, precise, calibrated to inform without inflaming. There were calls to return from board members who wanted to understand the transition timeline. There were 2 conversations with the firm's largest institutional clients, both of which I handled personally, both of which ended with confirmations of continued partnership that I wrote down in a notebook afterward, not because I needed the record, but because my father had always written things down that mattered. Margaret Osei came by the office on Wednesday afternoon. She knocked on the open door and stood in the frame for a moment before coming in, a courtesy I understood being paid to the weight of the room. "Your father interviewed me for 3 hours before he offered me this seat," she said, settling into the chair across from the desk that had been his, that was now fully and without equivocation mine. He asked me every question twice, different wording each time. She looked at the surface of the desk with something that wasn't quite nostalgia, but was adjacent to it. I asked him why. He said the first answer is what you've prepared. The second answer is what you think. I looked at her. "What did he ask you?" I said. "He asked what I would do," she said, "if I ever found myself in a room where the wrong person was being put in charge of something important." She paused. I told him I would make sure the right person knew about it. "You kept that promise," I said. "Roland kept it first." She folded her hands in her lap. "I kept it second. We're both a little late." She held my gaze. "I want you to know that I'm aware of that." "You're here now," I said. "That's what matters." She nodded once the nod of a woman who accepts accountability without performing it, and we moved on to the business of rebuilding. The audit's preliminary findings came in on the 9th day. I was at the desk when Nathaniel called. He read them to me in the flat, careful voice he used when the facts were serious enough that they didn't require additional weight from his delivery. The forensic team had found 3 areas of concern beyond the forged amendment. The first, a series of vendor contracts totaling $2.3 million over 18 months, awarded to a consulting firm with no public profile and a registered address that turned out to be a UPS store in Buckhead. The contracts were approved through a procurement process that had bypassed the standard 3-quote requirement each time. Signed off by Derek in his capacity as a managing director with operational authority. The second 4 internal strategy documents marked confidential, including 2 containing proprietary client portfolio analysis that had been forwarded from Derek's firm email account to an external address the forensic team had traced with moderate confidence to a domain registered 6 months prior to a Shell LLC. The third, a deferred compensation arrangement structured as a consulting retainer that would have paid Sienna Carter $340,000 in the 18 months following her appointment as CEO, drawn from a discretionary operating fund that technically fell within Derek's signature authority but clearly exceeded its intended scope. I listened to all of it without speaking. When Nathaniel finished, I said, "How long to finalize the full report?" 10 days, he said. Possibly 8. File it complete, I said. Everything documented. Nothing summarized away. A pause. Amelia. Some of this will become public record if it goes to litigation. I know, I said. Derek's attorney has already reached out about a settlement framework that would... Nathaniel. I said his name in the way I had learned recently to say things that were not invitations to debate. File it complete. He filed it complete. The news moved through Atlanta's business community the way news moves in cities built on networks, not through press releases or official announcements, but through the organic, rapid transmission of people who know each other, telling people who know each other. By the end of the second week, I had received 43 calls, 11 of which I returned personally, the rest of which Nathaniel's office handled, with a brief statement confirming that Hargrove Capital was under new operational leadership and remained fully committed to its client relationships. The call I returned first was from a woman named Constance Hargrove Bell. My father's sister, my aunt. A woman who had lived in Birmingham for 30 years and who I had not spoken to in 14 months, because the geography of our grief after my father died had arranged itself in ways that made contact harder than either of us had intended. She called on a Thursday evening. I was still at the office. I heard, she said. I know, I said. Elias always said you were the one. Her voice had the particular resonance of a woman in her late 60s who has stopped softening things she believes. He said it at your wedding. He said it at your graduation. He said it at breakfast the last time I saw him 6 weeks before he died. A pause. He said, "Watch Amelia. She's doing the long work." I looked out the floor-to-ceiling window at the Atlanta skyline. The same view Sienna Carter had stood in front of 2 weeks ago, using it as a backdrop. The same lights my father had looked at from this same window for 23 years. "Aunt Constance," I said, "come visit?" "I'm already packed," she said. The domino that mattered most fell on a Friday afternoon 17 days after the board meeting. I was in a working session with Margaret and Roland when my phone buzzed on the table. Nathaniel. I excused myself and stepped into the corridor. "Derek's attorney just called," Nathaniel said. "His client is withdrawing the settlement offer." I frowned. Withdrawing the offer he made. He wants to negotiate a different framework. A pause with a very specific texture. The forensic report has apparently been shared through channels I'm still tracing with the Georgia Secretary of State's office. There's a preliminary inquiry open on the vendor contracts. I stood in the corridor of the 38th floor. The carpet under my feet, the hum of the building around me. "That wasn't us," I said. "No," Nathaniel said. "It wasn't." We were both quiet for a moment. "Roland," I said. That would be my guess, Nathaniel said. He has a 30-year relationship with someone in that office. And he was very precise when I spoke to him yesterday about not wanting to discuss what he'd done over the weekend. I looked back through the glass at Roland Okafor, sitting at the conference table, reviewing a document with Margaret, his reading glasses low on his nose, his expression entirely serene. Tell Derek's attorney, I said, that we'll review whatever framework his client wants to propose, through proper channels, on our timeline. And the inquiry. That's not ours to manage, I said. That's the Secretary of State's. I went back into the room. Roland looked up as I settled into my chair. His expression didn't change. His hands were folded on the table in front of him, patient and still. Everything all right? Margaret asked. Everything's moving, I said. Roland nodded slowly, the nod of a man who has watched a great many things move over a great many years, and understands that motion in the right direction is its own form of resolution. Your father used to say, he said not to anyone specifically in the tone of a man returning something he'd been holding for safekeeping, that a company is only as sound as the person at the center of it, not the person at the top. He looked at me. The center. I looked back at him. Outside, Atlanta was doing what it always did. Moving, building, carrying forward the weight of everything that had been constructed in it by people who understood that the work was never finished, only handed on. The ring on my right hand caught the afternoon light. The table held everything we placed on it. The center held. The Secretary of State's inquiry became public on a Tuesday morning, 6 weeks after the board meeting. I found out the way most people in Atlanta found out, not through an official notification, but through a text message from Diane, who had flown in from Washington the previous Friday and was sitting across from me at the kitchen table on Habersham Road, eating toast, when her phone lit up with an alert from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. She turned the phone so I could read the headline. Former Hargrove Capital Managing Director under state investigation for alleged financial misconduct. I read it once. Then I put down my coffee cup and picked up my phone and called Nathaniel. I know, he said before I spoke. The timing. The Secretary of State's office moves on its own schedule, he said. We didn't accelerate it, and we couldn't have delayed it. This is where it was always going. I stood at the kitchen window. The November light was doing what it did at that hour, coming in low and amber, catching the edges of things. Diane was watching me from the table with the expression of a woman who has known someone for 27 years and understands when to be quiet. Is there anything we need to do? I asked. Cooperate fully with any requests for documentation, which we've already committed to, Nathaniel said. Issue a brief statement through the firm confirming awareness of the inquiry and our full cooperation. Then do nothing else, because we don't need to. Draft the statement, I said. Send it to me before it goes out. I hung up. I went back to the table. Diane refilled my coffee without being asked. How are you? She said. I looked at the phone in my hand, at the headline still visible on her screen, at the kitchen where I had stood 11 years of mornings making coffee, watching light change, believing I was choosing smallness when in fact I was being managed into it. I'm fine, I said. And then, because Diane had known me since we were 19 years old and deserved the fuller version, I'm more fine than I expected to be. That's the strange part. She nodded. That's not strange, she said. That's what happens when you stop carrying something that wasn't yours. The statement went out at 11 a.m., 14 sentences. Nathaniel's language clean and measured with one paragraph. I'd written myself a brief acknowledgement of the firm's history and its commitment to the values its founder had established. I put my father's name in it, not prominently, just present. The way a foundation is present in a building not visible from the outside, but load-bearing in every sense. The response was immediate and in its particular way instructive. By noon, I had 17 messages from people in Atlanta's business and civic community. Not all of them were supportive in tone. A few were carefully neutral, the communications of people assessing which way the current was running before committing to a direction. But the majority were direct and warm, in the way that people are direct and warm when they've been waiting for a permission they didn't know they were waiting for. A woman named Patricia Osei. No relation to Margaret, just the coincidence of a shared surname. In a city where certain families ran deep, who ran a real estate investment firm on Peachtree Street and had known my father since the 1990s, called me personally. Elias would be insufferably pleased right now, she said. I say that with complete affection. I laughed for the first time in what felt like a long while. He would, I said. There are people, she said, her voice shifting into a register that was still warm but also precise, who have been waiting to do business with Hargrove Capital in a way they couldn't quite justify before. The reasons were never entirely articulable. They just waited. A pause. I think you'll find that the phone starts ringing differently in the next few weeks. She was right. By the end of the first week after the inquiry became public, I had received 11 new business inquiries, 3 of them from firms that had previously declined meetings during Derek's operational tenure, for reasons their representatives in the new candor that circumstances had created were now willing to articulate plainly. One of them told me directly that he'd heard Derek present Hargrove Capital at a function 2 years ago, and something hadn't sat right. He couldn't name it then. He could name it now. I met with all 11. I also, during that same week, had a conversation I hadn't anticipated. It came on a Thursday afternoon, a knock on the open office door. And I looked up to find a young woman, mid-20s, natural hair, pulled back, the specific composure of someone who has prepared carefully for a moment they're not entirely sure they deserve standing in the frame. Miss Hargrove, she said. My name is Kazia. I'm an analyst on the 3rd floor. I've been with the firm for 14 months. She paused. I know this is irregular. I can come back if... Come in, I said. She came in, sat in the chair across the desk, placed her hands in her lap in the manner of someone who has been taught that fidgeting communicates weakness and is working very hard to override the instinct. I want to tell you something, she said, about what it was like here before. I looked at her. Tell me, I said. She told me. It took 22 minutes. She was precise and chronological and did not editorialize, except where the facts themselves were sufficiently editorial. She told me about meetings she had not been invited to, about analyses she had produced that appeared in presentations without her name on them, about a performance review conducted by Derek's deputy 8 months ago that had rated her initiative as below expectations. In the same quarter, she had generated a research note that the firm had used without attribution in 3 client pitches. She told me about a morning 4 months ago when she had arrived early to find a document on the printer that she recognized as her own work, reformatted with someone else's name in the header. She told me all of it, with the directness of someone who has held something carefully for a long time and has decided finally that careful holding is no longer the correct response. When she finished, I looked at her for a moment. How old are you? I said. 26, she said. Kazia, I said. I want you to send me your full research portfolio, everything you've produced in 14 months, with your name on all of it. I paused. Then I want you to come back here on Monday morning, and we're going to talk about what you want your next 5 years to look like. Something moved across her face, not relief exactly, but the expression of a person receiving a thing that they had stopped allowing themselves to expect. Yes, ma'am, she said. After she left, I sat at the desk for a while. The afternoon light was doing its low amber thing again, coming through the floor-to-ceiling glass, laying itself across the mahogany surface in a way that made the wood look exactly the color it had looked when I was 9 years old, pressing a house key into the underside of the corner and listening to my father laugh. I thought about the envelope in my blazer pocket, about the line I had memorized before I'd even finished reading it. Power isn't something you display, it's something you hold. I thought about holding it. What that meant fully understood. Not just protecting it from the people who wanted to take it. Not just wielding it in rooms where it needed to be seen. But using it for the thing it was always meant for, which was in my father's understanding, and now in mine. The construction of something that would outlast the moment. That would keep standing after you were gone. That would give the Casias of the world a floor to stand on. That was the work, not the meeting on the 14th. Not the document in the center of the table. Not even the investigation that was now moving through official channels on its own irreversible momentum. The work was this, a 26-year-old analyst sending me 14 months of research with her name on it. A phone ringing differently. A building on Auburn Avenue that still had my father's name over the door. The work was staying. I looked at the Atlanta skyline in the late afternoon light. 38th floor. Floor-to-ceiling glass. The city doing what it always did, carrying forward building on refusing to be finished. My phone buzzed on the desk. A message from Diane Wine tonight. I leave Saturday and you owe me a full debrief. I looked at the message for a moment. Then I typed back. Come at 7. Bring the good bottle. I put the phone down. I picked up the next document on the desk. I got back to work. I went back to the office on Auburn Avenue on a Saturday, not the Hargrove Capitol Tower on Peachtree Center. The original office. The one my father had opened in 1979 with 2 employees and a fax machine and a reputation for being the kind of man who didn't need to raise his voice. The building that had gone per his estate instructions to a community foundation, but whose ground floor office space the foundation had kept available per a separate arrangement Nathaniel had structured at my father's request for use by family at any time. I had not been there since the week after the funeral. 7 years. I drove there on a gray Saturday morning in early December, parked on Auburn Avenue. Sat in my car for a moment, looking at the facade red brick 3 stories the Hargrove name. Still in the transom above the entrance in the original brass lettering my father had installed in 1982 and refused to update because he said fonts that tried too hard made people nervous. I went in. The foundation staff didn't work weekends, so the building was quiet in the particular way of old buildings when no one is moving through them, not empty exactly, but resting. The ground floor office smelled like wood and old paper and something I couldn't name precisely, but recognized immediately as the smell of my childhood Saturdays, when my father would bring me here while he caught up on work, and I would sit on the floor behind his desk and read or draw, or simply be in the room with him, which was for a long time one of my favorite places to be. The desk was still there, not his desk from the tower, that one I was using now, which felt right, which felt like continuation. This was the original desk. Oak. Slightly scarred on the left corner from decades of briefcases and coffee cups and the accumulated contact of a working life. The chair behind it was not the same chair that one had been replaced sometime in the 90s, but it was the same style, same height, same particular angle relative to the window that looked out onto Auburn Avenue. I sat in it. For a while, I just sat there. The street outside was doing its Saturday morning thing unhurried, the particular pace of a neighborhood that holds its history visibly, that has been the site of enough significance that ordinary Saturdays feel like they carry some residue of it. I thought about my father sitting in this chair. The specific image I had of him here, not the formal boardroom version, not the gala version, but the Saturday version. Shirt collar open, reading glasses low on his nose. A yellow legal pad covered in handwriting that moved faster when he was working through something he was excited about. I thought about 11 years of a life arranged around someone else's comfort with the size of my ambitions. I thought about Kezia, who had come into my office and told me 14 months of truth with her hands folded in her lap. I thought about the audit and the inquiry and the 17 calls and Patricia Osei saying insufferably pleased in a tone of complete affection. I thought about Derek's key in the drawer next to the dish towels. I had moved it 2 weeks ago to a box in the hall closet. Next week it would go into a bag for donation, not because the key itself had any value to anyone, but because things accumulate meaning from the decisions made around them, and some meanings need to be released before they calcify into something permanent and unhelpful. I took my father's letter out of my blazer pocket. I had read it many times by now. I had it memorized. But I read it again there at his original desk on Auburn Avenue, because some things earn the right to be returned to not out of need, but out of respect for what they gave you when you first received them. The loudest person in the room is almost never the most powerful one. Let him build. Let him get comfortable. Let him make his plans. Just walk in, baby. That's all you have to do. I folded it back along its creases. I held it in both hands for a moment. Then I placed it in the center desk drawer, not the blazer pocket, not the nightstand, not a box. The desk, his first desk, where it could stay available but not carried present but not await. I looked out the window at Auburn Avenue. There is a thing that happens, I have learned, when you stop performing smallness. Not an explosion. Nothing so dramatic. More like a gradual repressurization. The sense of the full volume of yourself returning to spaces that had been compressed for so long, the compression had started to feel natural. You don't fully notice it until it's over. And then you feel it all at once, not painfully but completely, the way you feel a room's temperature change when a window is finally opened. That was what sitting at that desk felt like. I stayed for 2 hours. I made notes on a legal pad. Not strategy notes, not governance notes, but the kind of notes my father made on Saturday mornings. Ideas in early form, questions worth holding, names of people I wanted to reconnect with, and things I wanted to build that had no deadline and no immediate urgency, but felt in the way certain things feel when you're finally operating from the correct center of gravity, like the right direction to move in. At the top of the page, I wrote 3 words. Not a plan, not a mandate, just an orientation. Build, hold, hand on. Before I left, I walked through the rest of the ground floor, the small conference room where my father had held his first client meetings, the narrow corridor with the framed photographs, early staff community events, a ribbon cutting in 1979 with my father in a wide lapel suit looking approximately 28 years old and entirely certain that he was building something that would last. I stood in front of that photograph for a long time. He was looking slightly off camera. Not at the ribbon, not at the crowd, but at something to the left of the frame. Some detail, some person, some private thought that the photograph captured without recording. His expression was the expression I knew best on him. Not proud exactly, not satisfied. Something quieter and more durable than either of those. The expression of a man engaged in work that mattered on a day that mattered in a life that was going in the direction he intended. I looked like him. I had always looked like him in the way children resemble parents who shape them both genetically, and by example, the bone structure, the set of the jaw, the eyes that people throughout my life had described as patient in a way that they meant as a compliment, but that my father and I had always understood as something more precise than patience. We were watchers. We were holders. We were builders of things meant to outlast the moment of their construction. I left the office at noon, locked the door behind me, stood on Auburn Avenue in the December light, and looked at the brass lettering above the entrance. Hargrove. Just the name. No title, no descriptor, no qualifier. My father had never felt the name needed explanation. It was self-referencing in the way of things built well enough that they introduced themselves. I put my hand on the doorframe for a moment. The brick was cold from the December air. Solid, the particular solidity of something that had been standing long enough to have earned its permanence. Then I walked to my car. I drove back through Atlanta, through the streets that held the history of everything my father had built and everything I was continuing and everything Kezia and the people after her would one day carry forward into rooms I wouldn't live to see, and I went home. The house on Habersham Road was quiet when I arrived. Aunt Constance had gone back to Birmingham 2 days prior, leaving behind a plant she'd bought at a farmer's market and a note on the counter that said, simply, "Keep going." Diane was back in Washington. The rooms had the particular quality of a space that has recently been full of people and is now settling back into its own register. I made tea. I sat at the kitchen table. I looked at the afternoon light coming through the window over the sink, the ring on my right hand, the quiet of a house that was entirely and without qualification mine. I thought about what my father had said at this table, in this light, in a version of this quiet that was 20 years ago, and felt sometimes like yesterday, the most dangerous thing you can do to someone who underestimates you is let them keep doing it right up until the moment it costs them everything. He had been talking about business. He had been talking about life. He had been talking about me specifically in the way that parents speak in general terms about specific children when they want the lesson to have room to grow into. It had grown. I sat with my tea and the light and the quiet for a long time. And then I thought about Monday, about Kezia's portfolio arriving in my inbox, about 11 new business conversations to continue, about a board to rebuild, and a firm to re-anchor, and a community on Auburn Avenue that had watched a name on a building for 45 years and deserved to see it held by someone who understood what it meant. I thought about all of it with something I want to name correctly because I think the correct name matters. Not triumph. Triumph is a moment and moment's end. Not relief. Relief implies the fear was larger than the preparation, and it wasn't. What I felt sitting at that table on a December Saturday in Atlanta was readiness. The kind that comes not from the absence of difficulty, but from the full and unambiguous understanding that you are equal to it. That you were always equal to it. That the work of becoming equal to it was done so long ago, so quietly, so completely, that by the time the moment arrived, you didn't need to prepare. You just needed to walk in. My father taught me that. I intend to teach it forward. There is something I want to say to you before we close. Not as a postscript, not as a moral attached to the outside of the story, but as something I've come to understand from inside it, the way you understand things that cost you something to learn. Power that has to announce itself is borrowed. Power that holds without announcing, that is yours. The people in your life who need you small are telling you something important. Not about you, about themselves, about the specific size of the thing they're trying to build and the specific role they need you to play in it. Listen to that information. Hold it carefully. Don't perform the smallness they require, but don't announce that you aren't performing it either. Just keep building. Keep reading the documents. Keep making the calls. Keep the ring on your right hand, and the letter in the drawer, and the name on the door of everything you construct. And when the morning comes, and it will come, walk in. Walk in like your father's daughter. Walk in like someone who has been ready for a long time. The room will do the rest.